Cheers, everybody, and welcome to another Griffi Analyze DI webinar. I am very happy to be here today, and I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from the world today. And if you are part of our live audience, thank you very much for joining us. I know you guys and gals are very busy out there. So thank you for taking the time out to join us. Now, I have a special treat for everybody today. We have a guest instructor that is going to go and talk about what we're going to be talking about in the webinar today, processing electronic service provider warrant returns. So before I introduce my co-instructor, let me introduce myself. My name is Eric Oldenburg. I'm a law enforcement liaison here with Griffi, and I have been for the last 4 years. Prior to that, I was a Phoenix police detective, and I did internet crimes against children for the last 15 years of my career. I met Brandon Hunter a couple of years ago when COVID hit, and we started switching our training platform from live to online to kind of complement our live training due to the current world circumstances. And Brandon joined us as a part-time instructor. Brandon has been in law enforcement for 20 years, investigating all types of crimes, including high-tech crimes, and has been for the last year or so, I believe, is now the lab manager for the Alaska State Troopers. Brandon is one of our most talented part-time instructors, so if you get a chance to take our class, please do so, and you may have the chance to learn from Brandon as you will this morning. Now, let's talk about what we're going to learn in our webinar today. Brandon is going to be handling most of the lion's share of this webinar, but I just want to let you know what we're going to be talking about first is kind of the standard structure of electronic service provider returns, what you can expect that data to come back in, and then how to use Analyze DI to process those electronic service provider returns very quickly, and then how to use the tools built within Analyze to identify people, places, and things, and establishing context and as well as attribution and things like that. So Brandon, if you want to go ahead and get your stuff all queued up, I will go ahead and pass it off to you. Before we do get started, if you guys have any questions at any time, there is a Q&A button. Please throw the question up in the Q&A. I will keep an eye on that while Brandon is teaching. So without further ado, I give you Brandon. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. Well, all right. Thank you for that very kind introduction this morning, Eric. Of course, it's been an absolute pleasure to teach with you, both live and in person. Funny story, the first time I met Eric, we were teaching live in Dallas at the Crimes Against Children unit down there, and I walked to the front of the room and threw his laptop on the floor. It was a really pleasant way for us to introduce each other, and I think it's really set the tone for the relationship over these years. So I am absolutely passionate about digital forensics. It's something that I love doing. I of course love the work that I do inside of the office, but I also like the work that I'm able to do outside of the office in the contract world, teaching for both Griffi, also for Samuri, and doing volunteer work for IASIS. I really do love sharing this information with other people, and my heart is in making life easier for investigators and helping them find the very, very critical information that they need so that they can solve crimes and ultimately bring justice and help rescue victims from the terrible situations that they find themselves in. So what we're here to deal with today is really one of those kind of frequent flyer issues where I have been asked to provide assistance for investigators on a somewhat regular basis to help them solve one of the many challenges that they face. And that's dealing with these electronic service provider returns. If you've been on the receiving end of these returns, you've probably realized that they are not always structured in the most easy to understand way. they're also not always the easiest thing for you to be able to download or get your hands on so you can actually start looking at them and reviewing the material. Depending on what provider you're dealing with, there's often many hoops and hurdles that you have to jump through to be able to download the information. It's often encrypted. It often requires additional passwords or additional steps for you to be able to view the information. And then once you do receive it, you've often found out that there's just a tremendous amount of content there, and it's often difficult to know exactly where to begin. So this is where using any of our forensic tools that are out there that we really commonly use can really help make that easier for you. And one of the things that I most like to do when dealing with ESP returns is I just want to answer that question of, is there anything here worth taking a closer look at? And to understand that, we need to understand the structure of our returns a little bit. So I've prepared some kind of cleaned, sanitized returns to share with us today. I pretty much removed any identifying any information from them and gotten them into a format that we can really share with each other. So I picked kind of three of the big ones that we see frequently. I picked a search return, a ESP return that comes from Apple, usually as a result of an iCloud request. I've prepared one from Dropbox, usually also as a result of some sort of search authority request to them. And I've prepared one that comes from Google, targeting specifically the contents of a user's Google Photos. Now, when you receive these, like I said, a lot of times it does get difficult just to download whatever return information you have. But when you start looking at it, you start realizing that you have some kind of really interesting or complex folder structures. So when you're dealing with Apple, it's often the case that you get them in these, the first file that you download will be this encrypted zip file. You'll go ahead and you'll decrypt that, and then you get another zip archive, and then eventually you extract that and you actually get the production documents. And this is a somewhat common thing across all of the search warrant providers. Expect to encounter archived files, especially expect to encounter layers of archived files. Once you get these extracted and decrypted, and again, Apple sometimes makes theirs a little bit difficult, you'll be looking at some sort of folder structure that looks like this. And often you're going to have a business records certification from whoever their custodian of records is, basically verifying that this information is a true and accurate representation of whatever search warrant or search authority service you provided them with. You often have a copy of whatever search authority you provided to the electronic search service provider. And you often have a document, in this case from Apple, a document that contains quite a lot of information about the user's subscriber information, how the user uses the services. With Apple, you get quite a lot of information about the devices, including how they were registered, who they were registered to, what purchases have been made using Apple services. Quite a lot of information that could possibly provide you additional ways to identify whoever you're investigating or whoever's records these may be. One of the intricacies with Apple information is you often end up with this account data links folder. And this requires some additional steps for you to take to actually be able to download the content that's associated with this information. If you were to go through the instructions, this does tell you how to do it, not necessarily the world's most simple process. But once you complete that step, you end up with your production documents. And that is the actual content of the user's iCloud storage. Now, if you were to open this, what you will start to realize is that you have some unique identifiers that tell you whose account this is, and you end up with some directory structures to store the actual contents of those device or those accounts. Navigate down into these, you end up figuring out who they belong to, and then you end up starting to look at a folder structure here. Now, if you're already kind of lost, you're already kind of frustrated, you're already thinking, man, this is a lot of work just to get to where I can start to see the photos. This is where I would encourage you not to fret too much, because this is where a tool like AnalyzeDI can come in and really help make this a lot easier for you. So the vast majority of the information in an Apple return, you're going to find in the cloud library. But let's say you didn't want to worry too much about that and you just wanted to start with the actual production documents itself. We could navigate back up in our folder tree to where we have the production documents, and we can use AnalyzeDI to show us the media contents of this folder very quickly and very easily. To do that, all we need to do is we need to launch AnalyzeDI. And we make use of something called the temporary case. And often when we're doing the online training, we don't really get enough of an opportunity to show the power of the temporary case. But from an investigator's perspective, this is one of the most useful functions in Analyze DI if you just need to take a quick look at something. And what better to take a quick look at than ESP return? You can tell really, really quick if there is going to be relevant media related to your investigation contained within that return just by using Analyze DI to process it as a temporary case. And this is quick and painless to do. From the File menu, you would just select Temporary Case, and we can see that this is going to open an empty workspace that we can drag files into. We give it just a minute to load. And once we have that blank workspace, we can drag whatever folder, whatever directory structure we want to into Analyze DI, and it will simply process with our default processing settings. So I'm going to make my Analyze DI window a little bit smaller here so I can drag out my folder. And I am just going to take the contents of this production folder, and really, I could even do the Apple search warrant return folder. It does not matter which directory I use. And I simply drag it into Analyze DI. Now we're using some live data here. I've picked some processing settings to make sure that it doesn't take too much time. Specifically, I've turned off the feature in Analyze DI that would have it process archives, because it's very, very common for us to have archive files inside of these ESP returns, and I want to make sure that I'm not doubly processing something. So I've turned that off, but other than that, I've left a really standard set of options on. And like I said, this processes really quickly, really easily. It takes advantage of whatever apps we have asked to run. In this case, I've asked it to go ahead and run face detection. I've asked it to do reverse geocoding for us so that we can expose some really useful, early on helpful information for our investigation.
Brandon, while it's processing, we got a question come in from LaPierre. I'm not sure if you can see that in the Q&A, but let me read it for you. It's, did you get that folder structure after following the bash process? I am on 50 hours of extracting now using that way.
Yes, so if anyone is not familiar with what LaPierre is talking about, that is exactly the process that is identified in this account data links directory. So if we go to the account data links, you're going to see you have a couple of HTML files here. And both of those HTML files, you could open these. And what they are going to be is they're going to be a bunch of links that will go out and obtain additional content off of Apple's servers. There is an automated process to do this because there could be several dozen, if not hundreds, of files that need to be downloaded, and they are of varying size. I mean, it is going to depend on how much content the user has stored on their iCloud account. So if you read the instructions, and I very, very strongly encourage you to read the instructions whenever you're dealing with something coming from Apple, because they are absolutely critical. If you read the instructions, it is going to detail, as LaPierre says, the bash process, which is essentially an automated script that you can run to go out and download all of those links for you and then decrypt all of those files for you automatically, which is very, very useful when you encounter dozens and dozens of them. Now, if you don't do this, if you simply get your Apple search warrant return back and you start looking through things and you go, there's nothing here. All I've got is this account data links folder, but I'm not seeing any messages. I'm not seeing any media. I'm not seeing any content. It's because you didn't follow the instructions and you didn't go out and download the actual content. This is a somewhat common way that Apple uses to discover information to investigators, and you have to follow the procedure. Otherwise, you're going to end up with no content in your return and nothing to process. Now, sometimes they do send it in different ways. Sometimes they do send it as a single file that can be downloaded, but this process is somewhat common. So yes, the long answer to your question, LaPierre, is this is a result of following that process. That production directory was created as a result of doing that. All of these files that are sitting in this directory, all of these encrypted zips were downloaded. Those were extracted. They were placed into these two folders and automatically decrypted as a result of that process. How long it takes is going to be a function of your download speed and how much content is stored in that particular user's iCloud account. So you're right, it can be a very, very laborious process and take quite a while. Shannon is also mentioning in the chat that Axiom has a fantastic tool for automating that process that will not require you to use the bash scripting method in Windows. This is extremely useful for investigators who don't want to have to do this at the command line. It's extremely useful if you're in a restrictive IT environment where they do not want to give you the ability to do that as well. So very, very worth going to Magnet's site and downloading that tool because it can automate that process for you and make it a whole heck of a lot easier than issuing the rather complex commands at the bash prompt that's required to do it if you follow Apple's instructions. So yeah, thank you very much for adding that information in there, Shannon. All right, so going back to where we were at, we can see as a result of our initial processing here, we have some early results. We can see that we have basically are looking at 394 files, and we can go through and we can scroll through these. We can see what type of content that we have. And for the purposes of this case, let's consider that these pictures, which you'll be familiar with if you've done any of our training, let's consider that these pictures are a victim in this case. And very quick and early on, we have been able to locate that information. That took very, very little effort on our part, just by dropping it in and creating the temporary case. Now we could also create a full-blown case. So we could create and we could add each one of those folder structures that we've received from the electronic service providers, and we could create a proper GRIPHI case with them. So I've done that. That's sitting right here. And we can take a look at the information that I brought in. We can see that I brought in an iCloud that I identified as belonging to rottenraymond@gmail.com. I brought in another one that I identified as belonging to Johnny Rotten at rocketmail.com. I brought in a Dropbox account from Johnny Rotten at rocketmail.com. And I brought in the content of a Google Photos return from Johnny Rocket at rocketmail.com. And this is really when we're combining multiple returns, or even the single one, we really start to get to leverage some of the functionality that's built into Analyze DI. So in this example, we have been able to leverage the power of our GRIPHI intelligence database to provide some automatic categorization of images that are found in these search warrant returns, or these ESP provider returns. So we can see early on, we have a number of images that have been flagged as illegal because we have matches for these images inside of our GRIPHI intelligence database. See, we have a number of images that are flagged as borderline illegal images because we have matches for them in our intelligence database. A feature that is also extremely important because it really reduces our workload is we have a number of files that have also been flagged as ignorable or non-pertinent, because the reality of it is these little icons are really not super important or super related to our investigation. You know, they do make up almost 20% of the work of the total work in this case, and it's nice to, you know, have 20% less work to do. It's not very often someone comes to us and says, have I got a deal for you? 20% work, less work. What do you think? So where we can get that win, I am all for it. So go back and we take a look at the representation of the files that we're left to deal with. We have a number of uncategorized files that still require our review, where we'd like to figure out what's going on. We have the illegal files for which we want to figure out what sort of context these have in our case. We have our borderline files, which we also may want to establish that very critical context in our case. And we would just want to review our ignorable files and make sure that we agree that these are not case relevant. So from this point forward, we can start using some of the tools that are baked into Analyze DI for us to start seeing if we can find some actionable information or find some case relevant information quickly. Imagine instead of 1,000 images or media items here, imagine that we are dealing with thousands of images, tens of thousands of images, lots and lots of video. Like LaPierre said, imagine you're on some sort of return process that has taken you more than 50 hours to download. There's going to be hundreds of thousands of files here, and you're going to need some effective methodology to go through it to expose what might be case relevant. This is where many of the filtering and sorting tools inside of Analyze DI can really make your life a lot easier. A really simple one that I often recommend investigators use early on is use Analyze DI's ability to process EXIF data and see if you have any images or videos that are in your jurisdiction or in places that are relevant to your investigation. And in Analyze DI, this really couldn't be simpler. From our main working pane in the tool, we have a map tab sitting down here, right almost in the lower right hand or lower center here. If we click that, we get a very nice view of all of the files that have GPS coordinates or GPS information in our case. So say we're an investigator working in the Phoenix, Arizona area, we could simply zoom in on Phoenix, and now we have a nice representation of the images that were taken in our jurisdiction. Provided, of course, they have that EXIF information attached to them. But often it helps us at least establish some sort of locality for where the majority of the images were taken or where this person has traveled or moved around to. And again, super easy to do because all we have to do is take a look at the map tab and we're seeing those images just right away. Something else that we may consider doing, especially for those of us who are working child sexual exploitation work, is we might consider taking a look at keywords. Those keywords might help us identify someone who's collecting images with common keywords that are circulated amongst people who do this type of thing. And it might help us find that actionable case relevant information very, very early on in our investigation. Over on our right-hand side, we have a keywords tab. We can simply take a look at the keywords that we have listed here. And if we filter on one of these keywords, so say we filter on this one, and we go back to our thumbnail view, we very quickly see the files that have a match for that particular keyword. Again, this can be a very, very helpful early way to identify case relevant content in your investigation without having to spend a tremendous amount of time reviewing the content. So let's talk about another feature that we have, a very, very useful one for those of us who are doing any sort of victim ID work or trying to identify people who are related to our investigation. We've identified, say, some known images that we know exist that have been commonly traded that investigators have been aware of for quite a long time. But let's say we're screening for evidence of production. We have a couple of different ways that we can do that. One of those is we could simply filter for files that contain EXIF information. It's very, very likely that the images that were produced by a suspect or an offender, it's very likely that those images still contain EXIF information. So a filter for images containing exactly that could be very useful for us. Analyze DI has dozens of filters baked into it, and you can basically filter on any metadata that's available for a file. It does not matter if it is file system metadata or embedded metadata. Analyze DI is able to offer you a filter for those different types of information that you may have in a file. So if we use one of our EXIF filters, and if we say, hey, I would like to look at files that contain any relevant EXIF data, we can be provided with a filtered list that shows files that can still contain EXIF information. These are very, very likely to be your first generation images. So if you're looking at the images that your target of interest took, a filter on the EXIF information may provide you with a much smaller subset of information to take a look at, and will probably help you find that case relevant information much faster than if you were manually looking through every single image. And really, that's what we're trying to prevent you needing to manually look through every image. There may well be a time for that, but early on in your investigation is not that time. So we want to give you early, quick gains so that you can identify the relevant information and then act on it. Another thing that you may find very useful is Analyze DI has some pretty robust face detection, and you can use that if you have a reference or a sample image of someone involved in your case. You can actually bring that image into Analyze DI, analyze the facial structure in that image, and then find other images in your case that match. And this can be very useful, like I said, if you are doing victim ID work, or if you're trying to identify a suspect or a victim or someone who may be involved in your investigation. Also extremely easy to do. We have a search tab. You would go up to the image search. You would very simply say, I want to search for similar faces. And then you would add that reference image. So in my case, I've placed one in my ESP returns folder. I can grab that image, I can bring it in, and I can do a search for it. And very quickly and very easily, we are finding our person of interest in our case, and several images. Now we can categorize these images so we can find them later by placing them into one of our categories. And for this one, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mark these as files of interest, because I want to come back to these and I want to show you kind of our last bit here, very, very critical and important step, which is going to be establishing context for these images. So to do that, I just need a kind of a selection of images for which we're going to establish context, and then I can show you exactly what I mean by this. So I'm going to go ahead and filter down on those images. And now we may have questions. Where did these images come from? In what context do they appear in these ESP returns? Whose return did they come from? Is there any other information about when this picture was taken, where this picture was taken, who took this picture, who's contained inside of this image? And that's the extremely critical establishing context step. When we click at these images, we can see a variety of their properties. Analyze DI makes this actually very easy to use by going to the grid view. And now we can start taking a look at, we can see our file names, but I think more importantly for this investigation is where did these come from? So for this, I would actually want to look at the file path. So we end up with some very early on, very easy information. We can see that for all of these images, they have something in common. All of these images are in ESP returns for the user Johnny Rotten at rocketmail.com. Specifically, we can see that some of those images are in the Dropbox return, and we can see that some of those images are in the iCloud return. In fact, we have copies of each set of images in each location. Really, really nice user attribution artifact, right? We have them in more than one place. It's probably not an accident. We start looking at these in a little bit more detail. We can already tell some really important information from the file path. We can tell that for the files on Dropbox, those are sitting in a deleted files location. So those are files that Dropbox has reported to us have been deleted by the user. We can even see that they were contained in a directory on Dropbox that was called My Girl. So we have, again, possibly another user action or user kind of artifact that is telling us that not only did they have these images, they put them in a directory with a name, and they have since deleted them. Interesting piece of information to have. When we take a look at the results that are coming from iCloud, we see that those are coming from the iCloud photo library, and we see that those are also in the deleted directory, which means that these files at one point existed on a macOS or iOS device. They existed in the user's photo library, and they were deleted by the user. Some very interesting information to have. Now, some of the other metadata that's in here, we should pay attention to. Our file system metadata is really related to where we have the file stored on our device. So we're not going to infer a whole lot from the modified access or created dates there, because those are all related to when I processed this information and started working on preparing this presentation. Our EXIF information we can expect to be intact. But one of the things that I believe you all will find extremely interesting is the amount of metadata that is present within these return directories. Once you find the case relevant information in Analyze DI, your work is not over. It is very, very critical to your investigations that you establish context. You may run into situations where when you establish context, you realize the user actually had no interaction with this information, or maybe they had tremendous interaction with these files. When you establish that context and you look at perhaps the chat or the message thread that these images were sent in, you may believe that they were produced by your suspect, but what you might end up finding out is they were produced by someone else entirely different. And without establishing that context, you may draw the inappropriate conclusions. So all of the different ESP providers provide tremendous amounts of contextual information. But here's the problem, and here's one of the challenges that we have, both as people investigating this information and people who are working on providing solutions for the people who are dealing with this, the people who are technical services providers. The amount of information that is provided to you in these returns is tremendous. It is also not always the easiest thing to understand. If, for example, we're trying to establish some context or obtain additional metadata for those iCloud photos that we know contain information that's relevant to our investigation, Let me show you really quickly one of the challenges we're going to encounter. I navigate into that cloud photo library and I can see my images. And in here, I also have a file that's called metadata.txt. I'm going to open this with Notepad++, and you're going to be amazed at how easy it is to view this information. No, I'm kidding. You're going to be amazed at how difficult it is to view this information. Now, I believe this is actually a JSON. We'll see if we can get Notepad++ to deal with us as JSON, but it doesn't want to, which means that somewhere in here, I promise you, is tremendous amounts of information about these files and where they came from, some more information that you can use for user attribution, or also just a tremendous amount of information that you may not understand what it means, and that Apple or another ESP provider may not even provide you context for what it means. That's one of our most significant challenges, is to understand what's encoded in this metadata. I'll show you one more before we wrap things up and conclude. And that's the way that Google Photos is dealing with their metadata. We can see that some of it gives us some information about deletion markers and photo features. That, to some extent, makes some amount of sense. But when we get into our albums and we start taking a look at what is actually here, when we start taking a look at the JSON files associated with these different files, take a look at what happens here. Tremendous amount of information, including the original device that took it based on the EXIF information, information about the original title of the image, information about where it came from, and some other information. But then you start getting down a little bit farther and you see that you have some Google-based face detection and the results of it. And then you have pages upon pages of additional metadata that has been provided by Google, some of which is very difficult to understand what it could even mean. My encouragement and my warning at the same time for dealing with your ESP returns is be aware that there is tremendous amount of information included inside of those returns, other than just the media content. You can take advantage of some of the tools, like you can use Analyze DI to help you find the case relevant media and start doing some victim identification work. You can use other tools that are out there, like any of the cloud warrant tools provided by Cellebrite, Magnet, by anyone else who is developing those tools. They often can parse some of that information. Just do not expect them to parse all of it. When you start looking at it yourself, you'll realize that some of the information is obvious. Some of it is a lot more difficult to know what it means. But going back and figuring out where this information came from, figuring out in what context it's found, will be very, very important to help you understand what you're working with and how you can utilize it in your investigations. So I hope this has helped illuminate a little bit of what we can do with ESP provider returns. I hope it's helped show you a little bit of their structure and some quick methods to provide or to take a look at the information in Analyze DI. Of course, if there's any questions, comments, or concerns, please join us for Analyze DI training at some point in the future, where we can show you even more ways to process and take a look at this information. So thank you all for your joining us today. It's been a pleasure to be here. I'm going to turn this back over to Eric, and I hope you've enjoyed.
Thanks, Brandon. Really appreciate the insight and the all the context and showing exactly how to handle those ESP returns. It's great. If you guys have any questions in the future, please, before I talk about that, remember we do have our complimentary online training. It is 4 days. It takes 20 hours, so it's 5 hours a day. It is currently complimentary, so if you have not taken our training, please do so, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that here in 1 second. But if you have any follow-up questions about anything related to this webinar, please feel free to get a hold of us. Questions for me, I am a full-time employee with Griffi, so you can get a hold of me at any time. I recommend if you have questions for Brandon, you email him, but you can use my phone number. Brandon, again, remember, he works full-time doing other stuff. So, someone just threw up in here, Brandon, a question new to CE investigations. Anything of note with Yahoo ESP returns? And I'll let you answer that one. We may have lost Brandon. Are you there, Brandon? I'm not hearing you. It shows your mic not muted.
No, thanks, Eric. I have 2 mute buttons and I hit the second one. So. Yeah, Yahoo ESP returns are not something that I have a whole lot of experience with. I haven't seen very many of them. I think the main thing that I would point out to you is process the folder structure and analyze DI and use it to look for the media content. Once you find the media content, you at least have a starting point for seeing what other information is included within that return.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Appreciate that. Again, any other follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to email me. You can text me, WhatsApp me, call me. And again, if you have questions for Brandon, remember, you may have a delay in his response. He does have a full-time job, and we're very happy to have him as a consult instructor with us. So with that, real quick before we go, I just want to go over our training, what we have available for those of you if you have not attended it. If you have attended our training, please let your colleagues know that it was excellent. I know it's excellent training. I've attended it. I've helped teach it. And we've got some fantastic part-time instructors that are doing the job day in. Every class we have, you're being taught by someone who actually does the job every single day. And we also have 3 different time zones available. You can take it for whichever time zone fits your needs. So please do not hesitate. The investigator course is designed for people who are on the investigative side of these investigations, and the examiner course is designed for those who are forensic examiners that are kind of doing more of a deep dive into the data or prepping data to create a case for analyzer or for investigators to review. And then we also have our GID administrator course, which is just 1/2 day. I think it's 3 or 4 hours. If you want to administer a GID, a Griffi Intelligence database, and share it with your unit or share it with anybody in the world, you can and keep it secure so no one can mess with it. Please, I highly recommend you take this course. And again, thank you very much for your attendance today in this webinar, and I hope to see you out in the real world very soon. Cheers, everybody.